Every empire believes it's eternal. Every republic thinks it's the exception. But throughout history, a hidden pattern emerges, a six-stage sequence that has brought the mightiest governments to their knees. From the storming of the Bastille in 1789 France, to the fall of the Tsar in 1917 Russia, to the upheaval in 1959 Cuba, these monumental changes weren't random acts of chaos. They followed a predictable, almost clinical progression. And today alarm bells are ringing, because the United States in 2025 appears to be walking the very same path. This isn't about predicting the future. It's about understanding the past. It's about looking at what actually happened again and again across different continents, different cultures, different eras, and recognizing that human societies move according to patterns. These aren't mystical forces. They're the logical consequences of specific conditions building on top of each other. Join us as we dissect this historical blueprint and ask the uncomfortable question, is America next? Stage 1 of this revolutionary cycle is normal governance. On the surface, everything seems fine. The government is in control, its authority is largely unquestioned, and the daily lives of most citizens are stable. The trains run on time, the courts function, the police maintain order. Opposition is minimal, confined to the fringes, dismissed as fringe lunatics or harmless idealists. Think of pre-revolutionary France under Louis XVI. The monarchy was absolute. The system had been in place for centuries, and its power seemed unshakable. The king ruled from Versailles, the nobility collected their rents, and the church maintained its grip on spiritual life. It's a period of complacency, where the cracks in the foundation are ignored because the building is still standing. The elite feel secure, and the general population is either content or too disempowered to challenge the status quo. They have their complaints, sure, but they're manageable. They're contained. This is the calm before the storm, the deceptive stillness that makes what comes next so shocking to those in power. Then comes stage 2, the rise of the intellectual critics. This is where the first real tremors are felt. It doesn't start with protests in the streets or riots or armed uprisings. It starts with ideas in books, pamphlets, and salons. Philosophers, writers, and thinkers begin to publicly question the legitimacy of the regime. They ask dangerous questions. Who gave you the right to rule? What makes your authority legitimate? Why should we accept this arrangement? In France, figures like Rousseau and Voltaire championed ideas of liberty, equality, and the rights of man, directly challenging the divine right of kings. They wrote essays and novels that circulated among the educated class, each page chipping away at the ideological foundation of the monarchy. In Russia, intellectuals spread Marxist ideas, exposing the deep-seated corruption of the Tsarist autocracy, the brutal treatment of peasants, the incompetence of the ruling class. These critics provide the language and the moral justification for discontent. They don't just say things are bad. They explain why they are bad and offer a vision of what could be better. They give people a framework to understand their suffering. And more importantly, they give them permission to imagine something different. They are the architects of the coming change, drawing up the blueprints for a new world long before the first stone is thrown. Their work is often abstract, theoretical, but it's setting the stage for something very concrete and very violent. This intellectual fire soon spreads, igniting stage 3, widespread popular dissatisfaction. Ideas that once belonged to the educated elite now filter down to the masses. The abstract complaints of philosophers become the concrete grievances of the people. This is where broken trust becomes the fuel for the fire. It's not just about poverty, though poverty plays a role. It's about a sense of injustice, a feeling that the social contract has been ripped up. In pre-revolutionary France, it was the crippling tax burden on the common people, while the nobility lived in luxury at Versailles, throwing lavish parties as peasants starved. The Third Estate, which made up 98% of the population, bore nearly all the tax burden, while the First and Second Estates, the clergy and nobility, paid almost nothing. In Russia, it was the catastrophic losses of World War I, combined with severe food shortages. Soldiers were sent to the front without boots, without rifles, without a chance of survival, while the Tsar's court remained insulated in opulence. And in Cuba, it was a corrupt, US-backed dictatorship under Batista that alienated a growing middle class, enriching a tiny elite while most Cubans lived in poverty. People from all walks of life, merchants, farmers, soldiers, and workers, start to believe the system is rigged against them. Faith in institutions plummets. They no longer see the government as a protector, but as an oppressor. They no longer see the law as justice, but as a tool of control. This is the tipping point where passive frustration turns into active opposition. Petitions, small-scale protests, and strikes begin to bubble up across the nation. The anger is no longer contained in intellectual circles. It's in the streets, it's in the factories, it's in the fields, and it's growing, which leads us to stage 4, the transfer of power. The old regime is now critically weakened. Its authority has been so thoroughly undermined that a new group, often a coalition of moderate reformers and determined radicals, steps in to seize control. This transfer can be surprisingly swift, and sometimes even bloodless at first. The collapse happens faster than anyone expects because once legitimacy is gone, power evaporates. In Russia, the February Revolution of 1917 saw the Tsar abdicate in a matter of days, replaced by a provisional government. Nicholas II, who had ruled as an absolute monarch, who commanded millions of soldiers, who controlled the vast Russian Empire, was suddenly powerless. His generals refused to obey him. His troops wouldn't fire on protesters. He signed his abdication in a railway car and slipped into irrelevance. The old rulers, isolated and delegitimized, find that their orders are no longer obeyed. The police might stand down. The army might defect. The bureaucrats might simply stop showing up to work. Power doesn't flow from the barrel of a gun. It flows from popular legitimacy. Once the people stop believing you have the right to rule, you don't. This stage is often euphoric. It feels like victory. The tyrant is gone, and a new dawn has arrived. In France, the fall of the Bastille was celebrated as the beginning of a new era of freedom. In Russia, people danced in the streets when the Tsar fell, but the struggle is far from over. In fact, the hardest part is just beginning. Because stage 5 is almost always civil war, the old order does not simply vanish. Loyalists, aristocrats, and parts of the military who benefited from the previous system fight back to regain control. They have wealth, they have weapons, and they have nothing left to lose. At the same time, the revolutionary coalition itself often fractures. The moderates who wanted reform clash with the radicals who demand a complete societal purge. France descended into the reign of terror, where revolutionaries turned on each other with horrifying brutality. Robespierre and the Jacobins, who had once fought for liberty, began executing anyone they deemed insufficiently revolutionary. Thousands were guillotined in public squares. The revolution devoured its own heroes. Russia was torn apart by a brutal civil war between the Bolshevik Red Army and the counter-revolutionary White Army, a conflict that killed millions and left the country in ruins. This is the most violent and chaotic phase. The initial hope for a peaceful transition gives way to a desperate, bloody struggle for survival. The nation turns on itself, and the ideals that sparked the revolution are often lost in the ensuing carnage. Brother fights brother. Neighbor denounces neighbor. The dream of freedom becomes a nightmare of suspicion and violence. Finally, after the chaos and bloodshed, we arrive at stage 6, the restoration of order. Out of the ashes of civil war, a single powerful figure or group emerges victorious. They are almost always more authoritarian and ruthless than the rulers they overthrew. In France, Napoleon Bonaparte, a brilliant general who had risen through the ranks during the Revolutionary Wars, seized power and declared himself emperor. He centralized authority, imposed strict controls, and launched wars of conquest across Europe. In Russia, the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin and then Stalin, established a totalitarian one-party state. They crushed all remaining opposition, created a vast network of labor camps, and imposed a rigid ideological conformity that made the Tsars look lenient by comparison. This new regime brings stability, but at a tremendous cost. They centralize power, crush all remaining opposition, and impose a new rigid order. The revolutionary cycle is complete. The nation is stable once more, but it is often less free than when it began. The revolution has eaten its own children. The people who fought for liberty find themselves living under tyranny. The wheel has turned full circle. Now, let's turn our lens to the United States in 2025. Are we seeing these same patterns? Let's look at the data. Stage 1, normal governance, has long passed. For decades, we've been in a state of rising criticism. But now, the signs of Stage 3, widespread popular dissatisfaction, are undeniable. Consider wealth inequality. Data from the World Bank and IMF show the gap between the ultra-rich and the average American is at its widest point since the Gilded Age. The top 1% now holds more wealth than the entire bottom 90%. Billionaires add billions to their fortunes, while working families struggle to pay rent and buy groceries. This isn't just an economic statistic, it's a social powder keg. It's the feeling that the American dream, the promise that hard work leads to a better life, is broken. People are working longer hours, with more education, and getting less in return. This is fueling a middle-class collapse. For generations, the middle class was the bedrock of American stability. But now, squeezed by stagnant wages, soaring costs for housing, healthcare, and education, many feel they are slipping backwards. A college degree no longer guarantees a good job. Home ownership feels out of reach. Retirement seems like a fantasy. This economic anxiety leads directly to political radicalization as people seek drastic solutions to what they see as a failing system. And what about faith in institutions? It's in freefall. According to decades of polling from the Pew Research Center, trust in government is at a near historic low. Less than 20% of Americans say they trust the government in Washington to do what is right most of the time. That number was over 70% in the 1960s. This distrust extends everywhere, to the media, to the justice system, to corporations, to academia, to science itself. When people stop believing that the system can fix itself through normal channels, elections, courts, protests, they start looking for alternatives outside of that system. They stop playing by the rules because they believe the rules are designed to keep them down. This brings us to a crucial point made by historian Crane Brinton, who studied these revolutions in his classic work, The Anatomy of Revolution. He found they are not started by the most oppressed, but by those who have something to lose, a collapsing middle class who feels its status and future are threatened. The truly desperate often lack the resources to organize, but the middle class has the education, the connections, the resources, and the motivation to organize. They know how the system works because they were once part of it. They feel betrayed because they followed the rules and still lost. This is exactly what we saw in Cuba, where Fidel Castro's initial support came not from poor sugarcane cutters, but from disenchanted middle-class professionals and students who felt locked out of their own country, is future by a corrupt dictatorship. Today in America, political extremism is no longer on the fringe, it's mainstream. We see a loss of shared reality, where citizens live in separate information ecosystems, consuming completely different news, accepting completely different facts, viewing their political opponents not as fellow Americans with different opinions, but as existential enemies. This tribal division makes compromise impossible. It makes dialogue pointless. It turns every election into an apocalyptic battle for survival. This is the fertile ground from which mass movements grow, promising to tear down the corrupt establishment and restore justice. As John F. Kennedy warned in 1962, those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. So where does that leave us? The historical pattern is clear: extreme inequality, government incompetence, a radicalized middle class, and a catastrophic loss of faith in institutions. These are not just symptoms of a country in turmoil. They are the documented sequential stages that precede systemic collapse. America isn't just showing one or two of these signs. It's showing all of them, in order and with accelerating intensity. The rhythm of history is getting louder. The question is no longer if a great power can fall, but whether America can recognize the path it's on and find an off-ramp before it reaches the final, irreversible stages. History is not a prophecy, but it is a warning. The future is unwritten, but the patterns of the past are etched in stone. Thank you for watching. If you found this analysis valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into the forces that shape our world. We'll see you next time.